Hello, I'm Professor Dana Haggard, and this video is on the creative problem-solving process. If you're interested in the analytical problem-solving process, which is a process used for regular, routine, or run-of-the-mill problems, then you'll want to see the video I have on analytical problem-solving, which you can find in the description below. This video we're going to focus on creative problem-solving. And if you've watched the previous video on analytical problem solving, some of the things we talk about as far as the steps are going to seem familiar because there is a common framework between the two, but because creative problem solving is for those things that are unusual, novel, things you've never seen before, there are going to be some differences. So we'll start by going through the steps in the creative problem solving process. Step 1 in the creative problem solving process is preparation. Preparation begins with data gathering. And when it comes to data gathering, you should talk to as many people as possible who know something about the problem you're looking to solve. This is also similar to the analytical process. In addition, you also want to work on your problem definition. And you want to avoid jumping in and trying to solve the problem before you've actually got a good, solid definition. And this is something called the plunging in bias. The plunging in bias is when you are jumping in trying to solve the problem before you really understand what the problem is. You really want to try to avoid that here. So you want to gather as much information as possible. You want to try to create the best definition of the problem that you can, and you also want to generate alternatives. So as many different alternatives as possible. Now, the last step in the preparation phase, which is step 1, is to consciously evaluate all the information. So you want to be actively thinking about the information that you've gathered, the definition that you've come up with, and any alternatives that you might have generated. This is where things diverge from the analytical problem-solving process. In the analytical problem-solving process, the next step would be to evaluate the criteria for your solution, and then go through, evaluate each of those, and select your alternative. In the creative problem-solving process, this is where you want to stop and take some time. Instead of stopping to work your way through and analyze each of the potential solutions you've generated, you want to give your brain some time to make some connections between unrelated elements, or elements you didn't really consciously understand as being related. So the incubation stage is when you are taking some time to step back and let those things that you know run in the background. My analogy for this is computer programs. So you can have multiple computer programs up, but you can be working on one window while something is happening in another window that you're not actually watching. And so this is a similar process. You're feeding all of the information into your brain and letting the subroutines in your brain work on this problem while you're thinking about something else. Incubation is a really important step in this process, and it's important to take time away from the problem. After you've taken some time away from the problem, or maybe while you're still thinking you're away from the problem, you may move into step 3, which is the illumination stage. And the illumination phase is when those unrelated elements in the back of your mind have clicked together and you see the alternative, or maybe more than one alternative. And it's sort of that aha moment where you realize, oh hey, this is how these things are related, or this is how this might solve my problem. And so illumination is that aha moment followed by the articulation of the creative solution. So actually explaining what that solution might be. The last stage in the creative problem-solving process is something called verification. And verification is where you take those solutions that you've articulated and you actively test them to see how practical is this solution something that's actually feasible, and will this solution actually address the problem that we've defined. Now again, as I mentioned, if you've watched the analytical video, then you already know some of these things are lining up with or similar to things in the analytical problem-solving process. Creative problem-solving is different in a few ways. The primary one is, of course, that you're looking at a problem you've never seen before, something very unusual and out of the box. Another thing is that you don't go immediately from generation of solutions to evaluating those solutions. You take the time in the incubation phase to let your brain do some of the hard work while you're distracting yourself with something else. Another important part of the creative problem-solving process is that you need to, of course, have a broad set of knowledge in order to be able to come up with creative solutions, and also sometimes to be able to properly define the problem. So the next thing I want to talk about are some threats to the creative problem-solving process. Things that can make it difficult for people to have the confidence to follow this, or that make it just difficult for them to come up with a proper solution, or maybe even the proper definition of the problem. So the first thing that I consider to be a threat to the creative problem-solving process is when people fear that they're not creative. And I hear this a lot from my students, that they think, oh, I'm just not creative, I'm just not going to be able to do this, I have a very limited imagination. Well, regardless of what you consider about how creative you think your imagination is or how strong you think it is, it's important to understand that creativity comes in more than just one form. And unfortunately, we as people tend to want to limit it or define it as very narrowly, that in order to be creative, you have to come up with something that's radically new that no one's ever seen before. And that's just not the case. Creativity isn't just those big, radical new ideas. Creativity can come in smaller forms, or in what we would call incremental phases. So instead of something big and huge, creativity can come in small bursts and build on itself. Rather than being a giant leap, it can be a series of small steps. So the first thing when it comes to dealing with this threat of feeling like you're not creative, understand that creativity doesn't have to be something huge. It can be small as well. Another thing in confronting this idea of I just can't be creative is to understand that while yes, some people are born with this creativity skill that's innate, sort of born with this ability to have great imaginations and come up with new things, creativity is a skill, not just a trait. So it's something that you can work on and you can develop and you can improve. And so you could go right now, stop this video, go over to Google and Google improving creativity, and you're going to get thousands of responses and results that show ways that you can, or tips for improving your creativity. And so the first thing that you need to do is get rid of that idea that you can't be creative. The next thing that I consider to be really a threat to the process is that people don't understand about conceptual blocks. Conceptual blocks are limits that we put on ourselves that we're not really aware of. So in other words, they're mental obstacles that prevent us from seeing the full scale or scope of an issue. And it sort of focuses us in narrowly on the issue rather than letting us be able to see the big picture. Now, if you went out, you could stop right now and go to Google if you'd like, and you could put in conceptual blocks, and it's going to come up with, again, many results and many examples of conceptual blocks. But a few that I would like to highlight that I think are particularly pernicious or particularly damaging. The first one is a commitment conceptual block. With a commitment conceptual block, basically what you're doing is you're refusing to, or you're unwilling or unable to change your perspective, or to admit that perhaps your perception of what's happening or your approach isn't the best one. Or maybe it's not that it's the wrong one, but that it's just limited in its scope. And so the commitment block is really one that it's important to acknowledge, that if you find yourself saying, no, we can't do this because I think, stop yourself right there and ask yourself, why do you think this? Is it a legitimate thing for you to think? Another type of conceptual block that I think is particularly pernicious or particularly problematic is the complacency bias or complacency block. And if you think about the word complacency, basically it's a lack of an urgency to change things. You're happy with the way things are. A particular type of a conceptual block that's a complacency block is something called non-inquisitiveness. And non-inquisitiveness basically means you're just not interested in asking questions. You think you have enough information and you'll just work with what you have. And that is a surefire way to limit your opportunities to come up with a creative solution. Because if you're only relying on what you currently know and you're not willing to learn anything new, then of course your solutions are going to be limited to those things that you already know. So the non-inquisitive bias can be really damaging in the creative problem-solving process. Another process or another bias or block that is particularly problematic is the block of ignoring commonalities, or conversely of fixating on commonalities, or we might call it stereotyping. So in other words, you take a current situation that you have and you're comparing it to previous situations you faced. In the ignoring commonalities block, what you're doing is basically ignoring the fact that there are similarities between what you're currently working on and what you worked on in the past. The stereotyping block is the opposite of that, where basically you get hung up on the similarities between two situations and you don't see how they're different. So it's important when you're comparing previous situations that you focus not only on what they have in common, but you also consciously try to think about what they have about them that's different or that sets them apart and makes them distinct. A third thing that I consider a threat to the creative problem-solving process is a lack of diversity of your knowledge set. In other words, if you know a lot about a single subject, but not very much about anything else, then of course your ability to generate new and fresh solutions is going to be limited by the scope of your current knowledge. And if all you know about is one thing, then it prevents you from being able to take insights from other areas and apply them in a new situation. And when it comes to creativity, that's an important thing, because a lot of what we might consider to be radical new changes or radical ideas when it comes to creativity, it's not that the idea itself is all that radical. It's the fact that they've taken two ideas or two concepts or multiple concepts that weren't used together previously, that someone had the brilliant insight to see, hey, we can put these things together to make something new. And so if your knowledge set is restricted, then it's going to restrict your ability to come up with those combinations because you have less information to work with. So my recommendation is, even if you're taking a class that you don't really see how it relates to your primary interest when it comes to your academic interest or your long-term professional interests, understand that you can learn from a lot of different things, and having that variety of information at your fingertips or in the file cabinet of your mind will make it easier for you to come up with creative solutions, because you'll have such a variety of pieces of information that you have and knowledge that you have more things to try to put together in different ways in order to come up with a creative solution. Another thing that I think is particularly important is to take time to actively set aside time for incubation. So make sure that you give yourself time to step away from the problem, to step away from thinking about things, and give your brain a break. Maybe that means going for a walk around your building, maybe that means going online and maybe watching a video of a cat or a lizard or of another professor, and just distracting yourself and giving yourself a mental break. And then coming back and thinking about things again. Now sometimes you may only need 5 minutes, but sometimes you might need a little bit longer than that. But be sure that you don't wear yourself out, you don't burn yourself out trying to come up with that answer. Sometimes it's easier and that will come to you quicker if you step away for a while than if you just sit there and try to slog through things. After that, I also think that it's important for people to realize they need to consider their environment they're having, or that they're thinking in. So your space is important. And for some people, they like to have bright colored walls. Some people like white walls. Some people want a clean desk. Some people want inspiration boards or creativity boards or thought boards where they have pictures of different items on them and they think that that's inspiring to them. Whatever works for you, figure out what that is and then make your office or your thinking space reflect those things that better your chances of coming up with some good quality thinking time. I myself prefer a clean desk and very little in the way of visuals in my line of sight, because I get distracted not only by sound but by other things in my visual field, and so I prefer to have things as streamlined and as clean as possible. In addition to thinking about the actual environment you're thinking in, it's also important to understand that sometimes you need to avoid thinking in isolation. So perhaps when you're working your way through that preparation stage and that incubation stage, you spend some time alone. But it's also important to understand that creativity doesn't happen in a vacuum. And sometimes the best thing that you can do for coming up with a creative solution is to go and talk to other people. Ask them, hey, what do you think about this? Or have them walk you through what their perspective is on your problem or their thoughts on your solutions. Sometimes, again, creativity doesn't come from a single instant where you have this completely new idea that just pops into your head. It's something that happens over the course of time, something that's built. And so sometimes a really important building block is the feedback that you get from other people. So it's important to take time not only to think about things in a quiet environment or an environment that you find works best for you as an individual, it's also important to understand the contribution that other people can make to the creative solution process, the creative problem-solving process. Well, those are the highlights that I wanted to hit on the creative problem-solving process. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you found it beneficial. I thank you for your time, and I hope that if you enjoyed this video, you'll like it, subscribe, and consider sending it to some of your friends. Thanks.